He had everything: a billion-dollar empire, a penthouse overlooking Seattle Bay, a beautiful young woman on his arm. And he threw away the one person who built him. The day he signed those divorce papers, he told himself it was clean, simple. She just didn't keep up with me anymore. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that on that exact same day, his ex-wife was standing alone in a tiny apartment bathroom, staring at two pink lines on a pregnancy test, with a divorce settlement check sitting uncashed on her kitchen counter. She was pregnant, she was sick, and her heart, literally, was beginning to fail. And she chose to tell him nothing. For 9 months she fought alone, sold her jewelry to pay the medical bills, slept with one hand on her chest, terrified her heart would give out before her son ever took his first breath. Meanwhile, he was at charity galas, Forbes summits, Cabo, living his best life with someone half his age. Then one ordinary afternoon in the lobby of a hospital he had no business being in, a gurney crashed through the doors, and the world stopped, because the woman fighting for her life on that stretcher was her. What happens next will show you that the most powerful thing in the world isn't money, ambition, or status. It's the truth, and it always finds its way home. This story is for anyone who has ever been left behind, overlooked, or underestimated, and chose to rise anyway. Stay until the end. This one will change how you see strength. Before we begin, if you've ever loved someone who took you for granted, drop a right now. And if you want more stories that actually mean something, hit subscribe. We'll be here every week. Now, let's get into it.
The elevator door slid open to the labor and delivery floor, and a wall of quiet tension hit him. This was a different universe from the polished, hotel-like lobby downstairs. Here, the lighting was softer, the air felt heavier, and you could hear the faint, rhythmic beeping of fetal heart monitors behind closed doors. Nurses moved with a brisk, silent purpose that made him deeply uncomfortable. He felt ridiculous and out of place in his custom Brioni suit. He caught his reflection in a dark window and saw a haunted man. His usual commanding expression was gone, replaced by a mask of pure panic. He walked up to the main nurse's station, a large desk cluttered with charts. A nurse with kind, weary eyes looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" "I'm looking for a patient, Charles." Charles said, his voice strained. "She was just admitted. It was an emergency. Her name is Evelyn. Evelyn Kirby." He almost said Evelyn Burden. The divorce decree had insisted she use her maiden name. At the time, it felt like a clean, necessary separation. Now it just felt like he'd cut off a limb. The nurse typed her name into the computer, her expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, sir. We don't have a patient by that name currently registered." "No, that's impossible. I saw her with my own eyes. She was on a gurney. They mentioned something called PPCN." The nurse's eyes sharpened with caution. "Sir, even if that patient were here, I couldn't release any information unless you're on her approved visitor list. It's because of HIPAA privacy regulations. I'm What was he to her now? "I'm the father of her child." The words felt foreign, like a language he'd long forgotten. "Sir, unless you are her legal husband or designated medical proxy, I can't help you." Her professional wall was up. It was a polite tone, but the message was absolute. "But I was her husband," he protested, his voice rising enough to draw a look from another nurse. "We were married. This is my baby." The nurse just gave him a look that had seen 1,000 dramas exactly like this one. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to please wait in the designated family lounge. If the patient wants to see you, she'll have someone from her family contact you." Defeated, Charles backed away. He stalked down the hallway to find the lounge. Small, depressing room with beige walls, awful chairs, and a TV playing a home makeover show on mute. He was completely alone. The silence in the room was deafening, filled only by the screaming monologue inside his head. He had left Evelyn. The story he'd told everyone was that they'd simply drifted apart, an amicable split. "We just want different things," he'd said. It was a complete lie. He had wanted different things. He'd wanted the cheap thrill of someone new, the ego boost of a younger woman, and freedom from a marriage that had started to feel like a comfortable old sweater when he craved a suit of armor. He vividly remembered the day he told her he was leaving. They were in the kitchen of their Queen Anne home, a sprawling estate that had just been featured in Architectural Digest. Evelyn was arranging fresh flowers from their garden. "I'm not happy, Evie," he said, the words sounding cold and clinical. She froze, a single yellow rose in her hand. "What do you mean you're not happy? We just closed the Rainier Square deal. You should be on top of the world." "This isn't about my work. It's about us. It's become stale, don't you think? We are stuck in a routine. We eat at the same 3 restaurants. You wear the same old perfume. We haven't really connected in months." She looked at him then, and her eyes, usually so warm, turned to ice with a sudden understanding that terrified him. "I've been trying to connect, Charles. You're the one at client dinners until 2 a.m. You're the one staring at your phone through every single meal. I'm right here, Charles. Where the hell have you been?" But he just waved her words away. "See, this is what I'm talking about. All this blame and resentment. I'm done. I want a divorce." He had expected her to cry, maybe even to beg. He had not expected the quiet, chilling dignity she showed him instead. She just placed the rose in the vase, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "If that's truly what you want, Charles, then you should go call your lawyer. But you need to know this. You are making the biggest mistake of your entire life. And you are a fool." He dismissed it as just the predictable anger of a woman scorned. Now, sitting in that sterile waiting room, her words hit him like a prophecy. His hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone and dialed his lawyer. Not the one for his divorce, but his corporate lawyer, a total shark named Marcus Thorne. "Charles, this is a surprise. I figured you were buried in the Mercer deal. Marcus, I'm at the hospital. Evelyn's here." There was a short pause. "Is she okay?" "She's pregnant, Marcus. She's in labor. It's an emergency. And I think the baby is mine." A much longer silence followed. Marcus wasn't processing this. Emotionally, he was processing it legally. "Charles, do you know for a fact it's yours? The timing lines up. It's possible. It's more than possible. What does this all mean?" "It means," Marcus said, his voice completely cold, "that your clean break just got incredibly messy. The divorce is final. The assets are divided. But proving paternity is a whole different war. If that child is yours, he or she becomes your legal heir. Period. It messes with your estate, your company shares, everything. That prenup you have with Evelyn is useless when it comes to child support. And with your income, that support is going to be astronomical. Not to mention your current situation." He meant Sienna. He meant the board. A public paternity scandal was the last thing Burden Global Properties could afford. "What do I do?" Charles whispered. "First, you say absolutely nothing. You admit nothing. You wait for a paternity test. You do not sign a single paper. You don't offer anything. In that hospital, you are a nobody. Understand? You have no legal rights there until paternity is proven. Now, go back to your office. The only thing you can do there is make everything worse." Charles hung up. Say nothing. Admit nothing. It was the mantra of his entire business career. But as he sat there, the image of Evelyn's face streaked with sweat and filled with pain, was burned into his mind. He wasn't a CEO in a negotiation. He was just a man who'd discovered he might be a father in the most shocking way possible. He couldn't leave. He wouldn't leave. He didn't care what Marcus said. He had to see her. He had to know. The blinding white light of the operating room faded away, replaced by the soft, quiet gray of a private recovery room. Evelyn Kirby's first feeling was a deep, throbbing ache that spread from her core. Her second was a profound, hollow emptiness. "He's okay, sweetheart. He's okay." It was her mother's voice. Evelyn's eyes fluttered open, struggling to see. Margaret Kirby was sitting right there beside the bed, holding Evelyn's hand. Her mother's face, usually a map of cheerful wrinkles, was now carved with exhaustion and pure fear. "Where is he?" Evelyn's voice was a dry, scratchy whisper. "They took him to the observation nursery just as a precaution. He's 7 pounds, 2 ounces, Evie, and he is absolutely perfect, a full head of dark hair just like his mom." Tears immediately streamed from Evelyn's eyes, hot and fast. "He's alive. I thought—" "Shh. You both are. You both made it." Margaret squeezed her hand, her own voice thick with emotion. The last few hours were just a blur of terror. The sudden, crushing weight on her chest, the feeling of not being able to breathe, the awful diagnosis that hung over her for 8 months. Peripartum, cardiomyopathy, PPCM, a rare, pregnancy-induced heart failure. She had learned about the PPCM a week after she learned about the baby, and she'd learned about the baby 2 days after Charles had signed the divorce papers. The timing was so cruel it felt like a sick joke. She remembered standing in the bathroom of the small apartment she'd rented, the divorce settlement check sitting on her kitchen counter, uncashed. She'd been feeling so tired, writing it off as stress from the split. But this was something different. This was a tiredness that went deep into her bones. The 2 pink lines on the test had felt like a death sentence and a miracle at the same time. She had almost called him. For just one desperate second, she held her phone, her thumb hovering over Charles's name. But what would she have said? "Congratulations, you got your freedom. By the way, I'm pregnant." Then the doctor's appointment happened. The cardiologist, a nice woman named Dr. Helen Rostova, sat her down with the results. "Evelyn, your heart's ejection fraction is dangerously low. It is PPCM. The pregnancy is putting an extreme amount of strain on your heart. We have to discuss your options." Options? Evelyn knew exactly what she was implying. Continuing this pregnancy puts you at a significant risk. A very, very significant risk. Evelyn didn't hesitate for a second. "I'm keeping him." "Evelyn, this isn't a joke. You could die." "Then I will die," she'd said, her hand instinctively moving to cover her still flat stomach. "He is all I have left." She decided not to tell Charles for a reason that was both simple and heartbreakingly complex. Her dignity. She had seen the way he'd been looking at her in those final months with a mix of pity and impatience. He saw her as a problem to be solved, an obstacle in the way of his perfect new life. If she told him about the baby, he would stay. The man was obsessed with having a legacy. He would stay, and he would pay for the very best doctors. But he would be staying out of obligation, not because he loved her. He would stay out of guilt. And every time he looked at her, she would see that pity, that resentment. She would be a living, breathing anchor, chaining him to a life he had already rejected. She would not let herself be his burden. She would not beg for the scraps of his attention. This child, her child, deserved to be born out of strength, not out of obligation. So she told no one but her mother. She used the settlement money she'd planned to use to start her own landscape design business, to pay for the endless, terrifying doctor's visits, heart scans, and medications. She spent her nights all alone. her hand on her growing belly, constantly checking her own blood pressure, terrified that every little flutter was a sign of her heart failing, praying she could just hold on long enough to bring him into the world. And she had. She had done it all by herself. "He's here," Margaret said, her voice suddenly low, pulling Evelyn out of her memories. Evelyn's heart, the very organ that had betrayed her, gave a painful jolt. "Who?" "Charles. He's in the hallway. He saw them wheeling you in. He's been out there for hours demanding to see you." A cold, sharp anger sliced right through Evelyn's exhaustion. He was here. The absolute nerve of that man was staggering. He had been parading his new life in front of her for months. His picture was all over the Seattle Society pages with her on his arm, and now he dared to show up here, at her most vulnerable, to try and claim some part in the miracle she had paid for with her own body and soul. "Tell him to go to hell," Evelyn whispered, the words tasting like poison. "Evie, honey, he looks totally broken." He did not know. He did not know because he never asked. He did not know because he was too busy building his empire and sleeping with his assistant to even look back. He did not deserve to know. Evelyn tried to push herself up, letting out a gasp of pain. "Easy, easy, Vats," Margaret soothed. "Just rest." "No, get the nurse." Evelyn's voice was weak, but her will was made of iron. "Tell the nurse to send him in, and then I want you to leave us alone." "Evelyn, are you sure? You're not strong enough for this." "I was strong enough to carry this baby for 9 months while my heart was failing. I am strong enough to look that bastard in the eye." Evelyn settled back into the pillows, the adrenaline from her fury giving her a strange, cold clarity. He wanted to see her. He wanted some answers. Fine. She would give him answers. She would show him exactly what he had thrown in the trash, and she would make damn sure he understood that he had no power here. This room, this child, this victory, it was hers and hers alone. The door to room 308 opened with a quiet hiss. Charles Burden stepped inside, feeling completely like an intruder. The room was dim. The only light was from the glowing monitors beside her bed. The air smelled of antiseptic and something metallic, like blood. Evelyn was propped up on a mountain of pillows. Her face was pale and waxy, and the dark circles under her eyes looked like bruises. She was hooked up to an IV and a heart monitor that beeped in a slow, steady rhythm. She looked incredibly fragile, but her eyes, when they met his, were as hard as granite. "You came," she said. Her voice was just a low, rough rasp. "Evelyn, my God." He took a step closer, his hands clenched, just wanting to reach for her, to fix this, to somehow rewind time. "I saw you in the hall. I had no idea. Why didn't you tell me?" A small, bitter sound came from her lips. It was not a laugh. It was like the sound of air escaping a punctured tire. "Tell you? And interrupt your vacation in Cabo? Or your big keynote at the Forbes Summit? I'm sorry, Charles. I must have lost the number for your new assistant." The sarcasm hit him like a physical blow. "Evie, that's not fair." "Fair?" She pushed herself up a little, wincing. "You want to talk about what is fair? Fair is you signing divorce papers with one hand while you're booking flights with her with the other. Fair is you telling Forbes that your ex-wife didn't share your vision while I was home throwing up from morning sickness and heart medicine. Don't you dare walk in here and talk to me about what's fair." "The baby?" He had almost forgotten. His eyes darted to the empty plastic bassinet over in the corner. "The baby? Is it a he?" Evelyn cut in. His name is Rowan Kirby. And yes, Charles, he is yours. Congratulations. You're a father. The words seemed to detonate in the quiet room. Charles gripped the metal footboard of the bed, his knees feeling weak. A son. He had a son. Rowan, he repeated, tasting the name on his tongue. Evelyn, I swear to God, if I had known, you would have done what? She challenged, her voice rising with a new strength he did not think she had. You would have come back? Played the doting husband out of some misplaced duty? You trapped me in a marriage you had already burned to the ground? I never wanted your pity, Charles. I certainly didn't want you then, and I sure as hell don't want you now. This isn't about pity, he snapped back, his own voice tight with desperation. This is about my son. You had no right to hide this from me. No right? I had every single right, she cried, tears of pure rage finally breaking free. I had the right to protect myself and my child from your smothering, selfish control. You build worlds, Charles. You build skylines, but you don't get to build this one. This one thing, my son, he is mine. But before Charles could even form a response, the door flew open. Charles, what on earth is happening? Sienna was standing there, her face a perfect mask of shock and fury. Her eyes shot from Charles to Evelyn to the beeping heart monitor and then to the empty bassinet. Her earlier act of having a simple stomach ache had vanished, replaced by the raw, jagged edge of pure betrayal. Sienna. Now is not the time, Charles said, desperately trying to get control of the situation. Not the time? I have been paging you for an hour. The doctor just told me my stomach is perfectly fine. He said it was just stress. And no wonder. You're in a maternity ward with her. Who is she? And what baby? She aimed a trembling finger right at the bassinet. The silence in that room was electric, humming with shock, with rage, and with grief, and Evelyn, with a calm that was far more chilling than any scream, answered for him. I'm his ex-wife, and that is the bassinet for his son. Sienna looked like she had just been physically slapped. Her head snapped toward Charles. His son? You have a kid? With her? The words started as a choked whisper, but then they grew louder. You lied to me. This entire time, all our plans. You let me talk about our future, and you had this secret? Sienna, I swear I didn't know, Charles pleaded, feeling his world collapsing in on him from two sides at once. I just found out. Right now. I am just as shocked as you are. Shocked? Sienna let out a high, wild laugh. Oh, well, that makes everything so much better. And what am I, Charles? Huh? Was I just the easy, uncomplicated part of your life while you were over here playing house? That is not what this is. You choose, Sienna suddenly snapped, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous command. She took one step closer to him, her eyes glittering with rage. You choose, Charles, right here and right now. You walk out of this room with me, and we never speak of this, or her, again, or you stay. You stay here, with your baggage. She waved a hand toward Evelyn, her face twisted in disgust. Charles was completely frozen. He looked at Sienna, the woman who was his future, the life he had so carefully built, fast, shiny, and powerful. Then his eyes went to Evelyn, the woman he'd thrown away, who was lying broken in a hospital bed after fighting for her life to give him a son. The heart monitor beeped on. Steady, steady. I need a minute, Charles stammered out. Sienna, just please wait outside. We can talk about this. No, her voice was cold and final. There would be no more talking, no more managing. Choose. He couldn't. His ambition and his conscience were at war, and he was trapped in the no-man's land between them. Sienna watched his indecision, and her expression hardened into something cold and permanent. I see, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She unclipped the $10,000 Gucci bag he'd bought her just last week and simply dropped it at his feet. "Have a nice life, Charles. Just send me a check for my things." She turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing down the long hall. The silence she left behind was heavy, more suffocating than the chaos before. Charles was left standing in the wreckage. He'd lost his mistress, his perfect image, and the last shred of his dignity. He slowly turned back to Evelyn. She hadn't bothered to watch Sienna leave. Her eyes were closed, her face was pale, with an exhaustion so profound it looked like death. "You should go," she whispered, without even opening her eyes. "You have done more than enough damage for one day." "Evelyn, please, get out, Charles." He wanted to argue, he wanted to beg, he wanted to see his son, but the finality in her voice was absolute. He had been completely dismissed. He turned and walked out of the room, the steady, rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor following him out into the hall, sounding like a clock ticking away the seconds of a life he no longer recognized. Charles drove for an hour, just aiming his car through the rain-slicked streets of Seattle. The wipers on his Mercedes S-Class swished back and forth, a frantic rhythm that matched the rising panic in his chest. He wasn't just a man in trouble. He was a man in total freefall, and he had just realized there was no safety net below him. He had lost Sienna. That was a logistical nightmare, a social disaster. Their breakup would be the top gossip in the Puget Sound Business Journal for weeks, but all of that was just noise. The real storm was Evelyn and Rowan. He found himself pulling up to a small, neat, craftsman-style home in Ballard, a neighborhood full of old Seattle charm, miles away from the world of glass and steel he lived in. This was where Evelyn grew up. This was her mother's house. He just sat there in the car for a long time, the engine ticking in the quiet. What was he even doing here? What could he possibly say? "Sorry I destroyed your daughter's life and almost got her killed?" He finally got out of the car. The air was cool and smelled like damp earth and firewood. He walked up the stone path and knocked on the heavy oak door. It was opened almost instantly by Margaret Kirby. She was a small woman, but she stood in that doorway with the unshakable presence of a mountain. She wore an apron. Her hands were dusted with flour, but her eyes were like cold steel. "You have a hell of a lot of nerve showing up here, Charles Burden," she said, her voice quiet but shaking with rage. "Margaret, please, I need to know. Is she okay? The baby? She is resting. No thanks to you. You march into her hospital room, bring that woman with you, and give Evelyn an ultimatum. After everything she has just been through?" "I didn't give her an ultimatum. Sienna did. I didn't know what was happening." Margaret let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You still don't get it, do you? You think this is all just about a baby. You think you can just waltz in here, claim you're the father, and fix everything with your checkbook. I want to help. I want to do the right thing." "What's right?" She stepped aside. A grim invitation. "Come on in, Charles. Let me show you what the right thing actually looks like. Let me tell you the story you were too busy to hear." He stepped inside. The house was warm and filled with the smell of baking bread and old wood. It felt like a home, and the contrast with his sterile penthouse made his stomach turn. Margaret didn't ask him to sit. She stood right in the middle of her living room, with her arms crossed, a grieving warrior defending her daughter. "Evelyn found out she was pregnant 2 days after you filed for divorce. She found out she had peripartum cardiomyopathy 1 week after that. Do you even know what that is, Charles? Or do you only have time to read financial reports?" He just shook his head, feeling incredibly small. It's heart failure, brought on by the stress of pregnancy. The doctors told her, in no uncertain terms, that carrying this baby to term could kill her. They strongly advised her to terminate the pregnancy. Charles felt all the blood rush from his face. He grabbed the back of a chair just to keep himself steady. My God. Yes, my God. And do you know what she did? She told them all to go to hell. She said this baby was the only good thing that came out of the wreckage of her marriage, and she was not about to let him go. Why? Why didn't she tell me? His voice was barely a whisper. I would have helped her. With the best doctors. Helped? Margaret's eyes were blazing now. Oh, you would have helped. You would have flown in specialists from all over the world. You would have locked her in a golden cage and monitored her every single breath, and you would have resented her for all of it. You would have looked at her with that same pity you showed her in the last year of your marriage. You would have stayed out of obligation. And my daughter would rather die alone than live her life as your burden. The truth of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She was absolutely right. He would have seen it as another problem, another complication to be managed. He wouldn't have really seen her. So she did it all alone, Margaret continued, her voice finally breaking for the first time. I watched my own daughter sell her jewelry, the very jewelry you gave her, to pay for the specialist that Dr. Rostova recommended. I held her hand while she got heart scans every single week, just praying her heart function hadn't dropped any further. I slept on her sofa because she was terrified she would die in her sleep, all while you were getting your picture taken at charity galas with that woman on your arm. You didn't just abandon your wife, Charles. You abandoned a terrified, sick woman who was fighting for her life and for the life of your own son. Charles sagged against the chair. The entire fortress of lies he had built around himself. All the justifications, the story he told himself about a stale marriage and a friendly split, it all came crashing down. He wasn't a powerful man who made a tough choice. He was a coward, a pathetic, emotional coward. She named him Rowan, he finally managed to say, the words catching in his throat. Yes, after the Rowan tree. It's a symbol of strength, of protection, because that is what he was for her. He was her reason to keep fighting. Margaret finally walked over and sat down, the anger seeming to drain out of her, leaving behind only a deep, weary sadness. She is upstairs trying to sleep. The baby's in the nursery. You can't see her. And you can't see him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. You have to go. He pleaded. Margaret, what do I do? Please. There must be something. She held his gaze for a long, heavy moment, seeing him not as a billionaire, but just as a broken man. You want to do something? She asked, her voice empty of emotion. Go home, Charles. For the first time in your life, look in the mirror and face the person you are. Figure out what you're willing to give up to fix this, because money won't work. You're going to have to hurt for this, the way you made her hurt. She stood up and opened her front door. He walked out, back into the pouring rain, a man who had lost everything. The drive to his penthouse was a complete blur. He stepped into the massive apartment with its glass walls overlooking the bay. The incredible view usually made him feel powerful, but now it just felt cold and lonely. He walked to his bar, poured a glass of 25-year-old Macallan, and saw his own reflection in the dark window. Margaret was right. This wasn't just some family problem. This was a moral reckoning, and the price to make things right was going to be far higher than any business deal he'd ever closed. The next 48 hours were an exercise in coming undone. Charles Burden, a man who built his entire life on being in control, completely lost it. He couldn't sleep. He just paced the huge, empty rooms of his penthouse, while the Seattle skyline seemed to mock him with its silent, uncaring beauty. He heard Margaret's words over and over again. You're going to have to bleed for it. His first instinct, of course, was to be a CEO. Just solve the problem. He called his bank and set up a wire transfer, a seven-figure gift, to a new trust fund in Evelyn's name. It was the easy, painless answer, but just as he was about to hit send, he heard Margaret's voice in his head again. "You think you can fix this? With a checkbook?" He immediately canceled the transfer. This wasn't a corporate takeover, it was a rescue mission, and the only thing he was trying to rescue was his own soul. The first real price he paid wasn't emotional. It came directly from his ambition. His phone buzzed. The screen read Julian Vance, who was Sienna's father and a venture capitalist whose company was the main investor in Charles's new $800 million development. "Charles," Julian's voice was like ice. "My daughter just got to Maui. She is a mess. She told me a wild story about you, your ex-wife, and some secret love child." "Julian, it's not what it looks like. It is very complicated," Charles started, falling back into his old habit of spinning the story. "Save it," Julian cut him off. "I could not care less about your trashy little soap opera. What I do care about is my daughter's dignity and my company's reputation. We do not partner with men who are one bad headline away from a total public meltdown. Vance Capital is officially pulling all its funding from the Bellevue project. Our attorneys will be in touch." And then the line went dead. Charles just stared at his phone. This was it, the first real cut. This was more than losing an investor. This was a direct hit. Losing Vance Capital would set off a chain reaction of defaults. It had the power to ruin him. This was the price. His entire empire or his son. For a second, he thought about calling Julian back, begging, making up another story, but he was just so tired of all the lies. He was tired of the image. So he did something different. He called Marcus Thorne, his lawyer. "Marcus, Julian Vance just pulled his funding from the Bellevue project." "What? Oh my God, Charles. You need to fix this. Apologize. Send Sienna a new car. Do whatever it takes." "No," Charles said, his voice quiet but incredibly firm. "It's done. I need you to do something else for me. I want you to find the name of every single specialist Evelyn Kirby has seen in the last 9 months or so. Every cardiologist, every OBGYN. I need a list of every medical bill. Then I want you to pay them all anonymously from a private account. Charles, that's admitting guilt. I do not care what it is. Just get it done. And Marcus, I want you to draw up the papers for a trust fund in the name of Rowan Kirby. I am starting it with $50 million. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end. 50? Charles, are you? And one last thing. Sell my shares in the Rainier Square Tower. Use that money to cover the Vance Capital withdrawal. We will just take the loss. The project moves forward, only smaller. I do not care about the penthouse floor. Get rid of it." He was actively taking apart his own legacy, tearing down the monuments he had built for himself, and with every command he gave, with every million he gave up, the awful weight on his chest got just a little bit lighter. He hung up the phone, took a shower, and put on his oldest jeans and a gray cashmere sweater. He did not drive to his office. He drove to a Target. He walked the aisles like he was on another planet and filled up a shopping cart with diapers, formula, baby wipes, and a little plush elephant. Then he drove back to Ballard. He didn't even knock. He just left the pile of baby supplies on Margaret's front porch. He was about to leave when the door creaked open. Margaret stood there with her arms crossed. She looked down at the supplies, then back up at him. You could not read her expression at all. I can't take back what I did," Charles said, his voice cracking. "I can't change the past year, but I can do this. I can be the guy who brings diapers. I can be the guy who pays the bills. I will not bother her. I won't ever ask for a thing. Just let me help. please." Margaret just stared at him, at the dark circles under his eyes, at the raw desperation. Then she looked at the supplies again. "She doesn't need any formula," she said bluntly. "She is breastfeeding." "Oh, right, of course. I did not know." Margaret let out a long, heavy sigh. "The yard is a complete disaster, Charles. The gutters are clogged with leaves. I was going to have someone come out, but it has been a really hard couple of months." Charles looked at the overflowing gutters, the dying grass. "I can fix that," he said immediately. "There is a ladder in the shed," she told him, and then she turned to go back inside. She paused at the door. "She has a follow-up appointment with Dr. Rostova on Tuesday at Swedish Hospital at 10 a.m. Not that you are invited." Then she shut the door. Charles Burden, the billionaire real estate tycoon, walked to the shed, found the ladder, and started cleaning out the gutters in the rain. It was the first honest day of work he had put in over a decade. Redemption isn't a flash of lightning. It is a slow, difficult, uphill climb. For Charles Burden, the next 3 months felt like the longest journey of his entire life. He kept his promise. He never called. He never sent a text. He did not demand to see his son. He just showed up. Every Tuesday morning at 10, he was there in the waiting room of the Swedish Heart and Vascular Institute. He would sit in a corner reading the Wall Street Journal, his heart pounding in his chest until Evelyn and her mother finally came out. He would just give Margaret a nod. Evelyn refused to even look at him, but he knew she saw him there. He was a constant, a silent guard. Every Saturday, he was at the house in Ballard. He re-stained the front porch. He pulled weeds from the garden beds, the soft dirt feeling strange under his perfectly manicured nails. He put together a ridiculously complicated Scandinavian crib that Evelyn had ordered, cursing under his breath in the nursery while Margaret held Rowan. The baby's steady, curious eyes were locked right on him. He learned about his son in these stolen moments. He noticed that he had Evelyn's thick, dark hair and what he thought was his own stubborn chin. His business life was in emergency mode. The Bellevue project was saved, but it cost him dearly. He sold his penthouse, his monument to his own ego, and moved into a smaller, practical condo in South Lake Union. He was no longer the king of Seattle real estate. He was just a guy trying to keep his business from sinking while he served his time. The miracle that the original story hinted at never actually happened. Charles was learning that miracles are for fairy tales. Real life is just about being tough. Evelyn's PPCM did not magically go away. It was a long and terrifying fight. Her ejection fraction, which was supposed to be over 50%, was stuck at a dangerous 35 or 38%. It was a daily struggle, managed with a mix of beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, and a miserable low-sodium diet. The real crisis hit on a rainy Thursday. Charles was in a budget meeting when his phone screen lit up. Margaret Kirby. His blood turned to ice. He grabbed the phone. "Margaret, what is it? What is wrong?" She's not good, Charles." Margaret's voice was tight with panic. "She is having trouble breathing. She's really dizzy. I called 911. We are on our way to the ER at Swedish." He was out the door before she even finished her sentence. "I am on my way." He actually beat the ambulance to the hospital. He was standing right at the emergency bay doors when they wheeled her in. She was so pale, and her lips had a bluish tint. An oxygen mask was fogging up with each of her shallow breaths. Her eyes met his, and they were wide with terror. "Rowan, she gasped. "I will get him, he promised. "Do not you worry about Rowan. You just fight. Do you hear me, Evie? You fight." For the next 72 hours, the entire world became the size of one hospital room. Evelyn was in the cardiac ICU. Her heart was failing to clear the fluid from her lungs. It was critical, and Charles took care of his son. For the very first time, he was all alone with Rowan. Margaret was a complete wreck, camped out by Evelyn's bedside, and she had just handed him the baby bag and tearfully said, "You have to do this. I just can't." He took Rowan back to his condo, and it was absolutely terrifying. He fumbled at trying to change the diapers. He warmed up the bottled breast milk. Margaret had a whole freezer full, biol, to the wrong temperature. Then he had to cool it back down, all while Rowan was screaming, his tiny face a furious red mask. At 3 in the morning, with Rowan still crying, Charles was about to start crying himself. He was exhausted, terrified for Evelyn, and failing at the single thing he had been asked to do. "Shh, shh. Rowan, please," he begged. Rocking the baby gently against his shoulder, he began humming an old forgotten song his own father used to hum while working in the woodshop. It was a simple, repetitive tune. Rowan's crying softened. He hiccuped, then snuggled against Charles's neck. And finally, he fell asleep. Charles sank onto the couch, feeling the tiny warm weight on his chest. And he just broke down. He wept for Evelyn, for his son, for all the years he had completely wasted, and for the profound, terrifying, unconditional love that was rushing through him. It wasn't about guilt. It wasn't just obligation. This he finally understood was love. The next morning, he brought Rowan to the hospital. Evelyn was stable. The medication had worked. She was still weak, but the healthy color was finally back in her face. He stood in the doorway, holding their son. Evelyn just watched him, her expression impossible to read. "He was fine," Charles said, his voice scratchy. "He doesn't like his milk when it's too warm, and he really likes it when you hum to him." At that, Evelyn's eyes softened. "You stayed with him all night?" "Of course I did." He walked over and, without asking, gently placed Rowan into the crook of her arm. The baby immediately snuggled in close to her. Evelyn looked down at her son, and then she looked up at Charles. The hardness in her eyes was gone. The ice had finally melted. In its place was something new, something fragile and a little hesitant. "Thank you, Charles," she whispered. He could only nod, his throat too tight to even speak. He didn't need some miracle. He just needed this. 1 year later, the Ballard house was peaceful, except for the sound of a small wooden block tower crashing to the floor, followed by a squeal of pure delight. Rowan, now 13 months old, was a little force of nature. He was walking, or maybe toddling, with a kind of drunken, joyful energy. Charles was on the living room floor, patiently restacking the blocks. His suit and tie were long gone, replaced by jeans and a worn Seattle Seahawks sweatshirt. "Again!" Rowan demanded, clapping his little hands. "Okay, one more time." "But this one is going to be a skyscraper," Charles said, carefully balancing a red block on top of a blue one. Evelyn watched them from her armchair, a warm cup of tea in her hands. She was, by every single measure, a completely different woman. Her hair was now cut into a chic, short bob. Color had returned to her cheeks, and her recent heart exam had been a major triumph. Her heart function was at 55%. She was officially in remission. She wasn't cured, but she was stable. She was living again. She had also, very slowly and cautiously, let Charles back in. Not as a husband, not yet, but as Rowan's dedicated father. He had never once failed to show up. He had been there for every single doctor's appointment. He took Rowan on weekends just so Evelyn could rest. He had dismantled his old life with a quiet, ruthless focus and started building a brand new one. It was smaller, stronger, and much more honest. His company had survived, now leaner and less flashy. He was, ironically, more respected for it now. He never asked Evelyn for a single thing. He never pushed her to get back together. He simply did the work. He's going to be an engineer, just like his dad, Evelyn said, her voice full of amusement. He is obsessed with how things fit together. Or, Charles countered, placing the very last block, he'll be a landscape architect like his mom. He just really likes the demolition part. He grinned at Rowan. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Rowan shrieked with joy and knocked the whole tower down. Later that evening, after Rowan was sound asleep, Charles and Evelyn sat on the front porch swing he had fixed. The air was cool and carried the scent of jasmine. My support group is meeting tomorrow, Evelyn said. The one I started online. It has gotten really big, Charles. We have women joining from all over the country now. A medical journal even wants to interview me. That is incredible, Evie. He looked right at her, his admiration totally genuine. You are helping so many people. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into this. You are just amazing. Evelyn was quiet for a moment, taking in his words. The old Charles would have offered money to scale it up. The new Charles just listened. I have been thinking, she said, her voice soft. It has been so hard doing this on my own, being a single mom and managing my health. But you haven't been a burden at all. You have been a support, and I am just so tired of being alone. Charles's heart nearly stopped. He turned to look at her, not daring to let himself hope. I do not know if I can ever trust you the way that I did, she said, her gaze direct and unwavering. That kind of faith, it's gone. You broke it. He nodded, accepting her words as the truth. I know. But, she continued, I see the man you are today. I see you with Rowan. I see you here. And I think maybe we could build something new. Not what we had before. Something different. Something much more real. Charles felt tears stinging his eyes. He reached out, not to grab her hand, but to offer his. He laid it palm up on the swing between them. I am not the man I was, Evelyn, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am just asking for a chance to be the man that you and Rowan deserve. After a long silence, Evelyn slid her hand into his. Her skin felt warm. Her grip was strong. Okay, Charles, she whispered. Let's build something new. He brought her hand to his lips in a gesture of pure reverence. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something better. It was real. It was a foundation built not on image or on power, but on painful truths and hard-won trust and the resilient, stubborn strength of a family that simply refused to stay broken. This was not a story about a perfect, magical recovery. It was a story about the hard daily work of finding redemption. Charles, Evelyn, and Rowan became a family, not in spite of the betrayal, but because of it. They rebuilt their entire lives on a new foundation of brutal honesty, mutual respect, and a love that was stronger because it had survived the fire. Evelyn's support group for moms grew into a national foundation, saving countless lives. And Charles finally learned that real power was not in building skyscrapers, but in showing up every single day for the people that you love. What did you think of this story? It was inspired by true events, and it shows that even after the deepest betrayals, dignity, resilience, and true second chances are possible. If this story of strength and redemption touched your heart, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories just like this one to light. Click the bell so you never miss another one. This literary work is intended purely as fiction. Any similarities to real individuals or events are coincidental and arise solely from the nature of storytelling. The author does not claim accuracy regarding real-world details and does not intend to portray real-life circumstances. You just heard the story of Charles and Evelyn Burden. And if you're still here, it's because something in that story hit you somewhere real. Maybe it was Evelyn, a woman who could have begged, who had every reason to reach for the phone, call the man who left her, and demand he show up. But she didn't, because she understood something that took Charles years to learn. Desperation is not love, and obligation is not a foundation. Evelyn made a decision that most people would call reckless. She kept a baby alone while her heart was failing, in a small apartment, with a divorce check she hadn't even cashed yet. Why? Because she refused to let the worst chapter of her life be written by someone else's guilt. She didn't want Charles back because he had to come back. She wanted nothing from him at all because she had learned the hard way that a love built on someone else's pity is the loneliest kind of prison. If you are in a season right now where you feel unseen, where the person you gave everything to has walked away and is living their best life while you are quietly falling apart, do not shrink yourself to fit back into their story. Evelyn didn't. She wrote her own. The content of this story, including its characters, narrative arcs, emotional themes, and dialogue, has been carefully researched, constructed, and manually edited by our creative team. It is designed to carry genuine meaning, emotional truth, and life lessons for our audience. While inspired by real human experiences, it is presented as a dramatic narrative for educational and inspirational purposes. We do not claim factual accuracy of specific events or individuals. Our sole intention is to bring stories of dignity, resilience, and redemption to light, and to remind every viewer that no matter how broken things feel, rebuilding is always possible.